wind had teeth out here. Corporal Ethan Cole pulled his scarf higher and kept walking, boots sinking into sand that still held the day's heat even though the sun had dropped an hour ago. His canteen bumped against his hip with every step, lighter than he wanted it to be. 2 days of walking left, maybe less water than that. He almost didn't see the marks. They cut across the dune ahead of him in long, black gouges, like something enormous had dragged itself through the sand and burned the ground doing it. Ethan stopped walking. He'd seen scorch marks before, from flares, from wreckage, from the kind of fighting that left craters where men used to stand. This was different. These lines curved. They had direction. Something had crawled this way, and it had crawled slowly. He should have turned around. Every rule he'd ever been taught said to avoid anything that could still be burning out here, could still be armed, could still be enemy. He followed the marks instead. They led him over the rise, and that was when he heard it, a voice, low and cracked, dragging itself out of something that didn't sound like it had the strength left to speak at all. "Just one sip, sir." Ethan froze at the top of the dune, and below him, in the hollow where the sand dipped low enough to hold shadow even in daylight, lay a dragon. He had seen dragons before at a distance in briefings, in the kind of photographs that made grown soldiers go quiet. This one was different from those pictures. Its wings were torn in 3 places, folded wrong against its body. Scales that should have shown dark green in the moonlight were dulled with dust and something darker underneath. One eye was closed. The other found him and held him and did not look away. "Just one sip," it said again, weaker this time, and Ethan realized the creature wasn't talking to itself. It was talking to him, begging him. He should have run. A dragon this size, even dying, could end him in half a heartbeat if it had one good breath of fire left in its chest. But there was something in the way that said sir, like it still remembered ranks, still remembered chains of command, still remembered a version of the world where someone above it gave orders and it obeyed them. That wasn't the voice of a monster. That was the voice of something that had been someone's soldier. Ethan's hand found the canteen at his hip, without him deciding to move it there. He had counted the water that morning. He knew exactly how many swallows stood between him and camp, and he knew the number was already too small. He climbed down into the hollow anyway. Up close, the damage was worse. The dragon's flank had been opened by something that wasn't a clean wound, wasn't kind of injury you got from an enemy who wanted you dead quickly. It was a kind of wound designed to make something suffer on the way down. Ethan had seen burns like that only once before, on a transport truck that had been hit by its own side in a targeting mistake nobody ever wrote up honestly. This hadn't been an accident. Somebody had done this on purpose. The dragon's throat worked, dry and useless, trying for more words and failing. Its remaining I tracked a canteen in Ethan's hand, the way a starving man tracks a plate of food he's certain isn't really there. "Easy," Ethan said, and his own voice came out steadier than he expected. "I've got you." He knelt in the sand, close enough now that he could feel heat still radiating weakly off the creature's skin, close enough that one wrong move from either of them would end badly. He uncapped the canteen. His hand was shaking, and he told himself it was just the cold coming in with the night. 2 days of walking stood between him and the next well. He had exactly 1 container of water left in the world, and a creature in front of him that clearly needed all of it, and none of the answers yet about how it had ended up broken and abandoned in the middle of nowhere, calling a stranger sir like it was still waiting for permission to survive. Ethan Cole raised the canteen to the dragon's cracked lips, and he didn't stop pouring until it was empty. The dragon drank like it had forgotten how. Water ran down its jaw and into sand, wasted. But Ethan didn't pull the canteen back. He tipped it until the last drop was gone, and only then did he lower his arm and look at what he'd just done. Empty. Completely empty. 2 days of desert between him and the well at the supply line, and he had nothing left but the dry taste of dust in his own mouth. He capped the canteen anyway out of habit and sat back on his heels. The dragon's breathing had changed. Still ragged, still shallow, but slower now, like something in its chest had stopped fighting quite so hard to keep going. Its one open eye stayed on him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The wind moved sand across the hollow in thin, hissing sheets. "Why?" The dragon finally managed. Not a full question, just the one word, like it didn't have the strength to finish it, and was hoping Ethan would understand anyway. Would have done it for any of my own, Ethan said. Didn't seem right to stop just because you got scales instead of skin. The dragon made a sound that might have been a laugh. If it had the breath for one, it didn't. What came out instead was closer to a wheeze, and it cost the creature something to make it, because its head sank back down against the sand afterward like the effort had drained what little strength the water had just given back. Ethan studied the wound along its flank in the fading light. Now that he was closer, he could see it wasn't a single injury. It was a pattern. 3 long gashes running parallel, evenly spaced, the kind of damage that came from claws, not weapons, not human weapons, not enemy fire. Something did this to you, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. The dragon's eye closed, then opened again, slower. My own, it said. My own flight. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He'd grown up hearing stories about dragons the way every soldier out here had. Tales passed around a fire about creatures that hunted in packs high above the front lines, loyal to nothing but their own kind, dangerous to anyone who was wearing the right scales. He'd never once heard a story about a dragon turning on another dragon. Why would they do that? He asked. The dragon didn't answer right away. Its gaze drifted past him, up toward the darkening sky, like it was looking for something that used to be there and wasn't anymore. Orders, it finally said. I didn't follow them. Before Ethan could ask what orders, the dragon's ear, if that was even the right word for the ridged fin along the side of its skull, twitched, and its whole body went rigid in a way that had nothing to do with pain. They're still looking, it said, and this time there was real fear underneath the exhaustion. For me, Ethan's stomach dropped. How many? Enough. That wasn't an answer, but the way the dragon said it told him everything he needed to know. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted the dragon hurt. They wanted it finished, and something had interrupted that plan. And now they were coming back to correct the mistake. Ethan looked out at the darkening horizon. Somewhere out there, in whatever direction the dragon's flight had scattered from, there were more of these creatures, and at least some of them were hunting the one lying broken in front of him. He had no water, no easy path back to camp. And now, apparently, no easy way to walk away from this hollow without being caught in whatever was coming next. You said you didn't follow orders, Ethan said slowly. What orders? The dragon's I met us again, and for the first time, there was something steadier in it, even through the exhaustion, like it had decided, somewhere in the last few minutes, that this particular human had earned the truth. There was a caravan, it said. Humans, fleeing something. My commander ordered my flight to burn it. All of it. Ethan's jaw tightened. And you didn't. I couldn't, the dragon said, and the word came out cracked, worn thin, like it had been carrying the weight of that single decision every hour since it made it. So they made sure I wouldn't get the chance to refuse again. A distant sound rolled across the dunes, faint but unmistakable. A horn, long and low, cutting through the cooling desert air. The dragon's whole body flinched at it, wings twitching uselessly against the sand. That's them, it whispered. That's them, and I can't fly. I can't even stand. Ethan was already on his feet, scanning the ridge above the hollow, his mind racing through every option he had, and coming up short on all of them. No water, no backup, a dying dragon that couldn't move, and a hunting party closing in from somewhere out in the dark. He looked down at the creature that had just handed him the one secret worth more than his own water. Then we'd better find somewhere to hide, he said, before they find us first. The hollow offered nothing. Low ground and open sky. The worst possible place to wait for anyone hunting from the air. Ethan looked around at the dunes rising on every side and picked the one that threw the deepest shadow, a ridge to the east with an overhang carved out by years of wind. Can you crawl? He asked. The dragon's wings twitched, testing themselves, and a sound came from deep in its chest that told Ethan everything about how much that small movement cost. But it dug its front claws into the sand and dragged itself forward, slow and graceless, and Ethan got his shoulder under the ridge of its jaw and pushed where he could, even though pushing a creature that size felt like trying to move a fallen tree. They made it to the overhang as the horn sounded again, closer now. Ethan pressed himself against the sand beside the dragon's flank, both of them tucked into the shadow, and waited. The dragon's breathing had gone shallow and controlled, like it was trying to make itself smaller through sheer effort. Ethan understood the instinct. He was doing the same thing. Shapes crossed the sky above them a few minutes later. 3 of them, wing beats slow and deliberate, sweeping the dunes in a pattern that told Ethan this wasn't a rescue party. This was a search grid. Professional. Practice. He counted the seconds between each pass and realized the dragon beside him was doing the same thing. Its one open eye tracking the sky through a gap in the overhang. Why does it matter to them? Ethan whispered, once the shapes had drifted further along the ridge. One dragon who wouldn't burn a caravan. Why send 3 more just to finish the job? The dragon was quiet long enough that Ethan thought it might not answer. When it did, its voice had dropped even lower, like the words themselves were dangerous to say out loud. Because I saw who gave the order, it said, not just heard it relayed. I saw him standing there, watching the caravan through a spyglass, and I know his face. Your commander? Commander, my flight. Yes, but he answers to someone higher. Someone who wanted that caravan gone quietly, and wanted no one left who could say why. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the desert night. You're saying this wasn't a battlefield order. This was a cover-up. The dragon's eye closed, and for a moment Ethan thought exhaustion had finally taken it under. Then it spoke again, barely above a breath. There's a name, it said. I heard it once from the commander himself before he gave the order to attack me. A human name. Someone on your side who arranged for the caravan to be in that valley at that exact hour, when it should have been 3 miles north on the safe route. Ethan's mouth went dry, and it wasn't from thirst. What name? The dragon told him. It landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan knew that name. Everyone in his unit knew that name, spoken with particular kind of caution, reserved for officers who had climbed too far too fast and stepped on whoever they needed to on the way up. He'd never liked the man. He'd never had proof of anything either. Just the general unease of a soldier who'd learned to trust his gut about the people giving him orders. Now, he had more than unease. You're certain, he said. You heard that name clearly. I have no reason to lie to you, the dragon said. You gave me your water. I intend to give you the truth, for whatever that's worth to a dying creature in the sand. You're not dying, Ethan said, more firmly than he expected. Not on my watch. The dragon's eye opened again, and something in its expression shifted. Not quite a smile. Dragons probably weren't built for that, but something close enough that Ethan understood it anyway. Above them, the horn sounded a 3rd time, and this time it didn't fade. It held steady, closer than before, like whoever was leading the search had picked up a trail and didn't plan on losing again. Ethan looked at the dragon, still too weak to fly, still too heavy to carry, and then looked out the dark shapes now circling lower against the stars. Whatever came next, they were going to have to face it together, and there was no more time left to plan how. The shapes in the sky didn't leave. They circled lower, tightening their search pattern around the ridge. And Ethan understood with a sinking certainty that staying still wasn't going to work much longer. Whoever led that search knew how to hunt. We move, he said quietly. Now, while they're still spread wide. The dragon's claws dug into the sand, and it hauled itself up onto legs that shook under the weight they were being asked to carry. It made it 3 steps before its wing caught on a jet of rock, and went down hard, sand exploding around it, and Ethan was there before the dust settled, getting a shoulder under its foreleg, taking as much weight as his body could manage. I can't fly, the dragon said, and there was something raw in its voice that had nothing to do with physical pain. I can't even walk without falling. You should leave me. Take what water you. I don't have water, Ethan said. You drank it, so we're both walking out of here, or neither of us is. They moved through the dunes at a pace that felt agonizingly slow, the dragon leaning into Ethan's shoulder more than either of them wanted to admit. Ethan's legs burning under a weight they weren't built for. Every few minutes they stopped, pressed into whatever shadow the terrain offered, and waited for a search pattern to pass overhead before continuing. It was during one of those pauses, huddled in the lee of a rock formation with the dragon's ragged breathing slowing beside him, that Ethan noticed something strange. The wound along the dragon's flank, the one that had been weeping dark fluid into the sand back in a hollow, had stopped bleeding, not healed, but stopped. That Water, Ethan said. Is it doing something? Beyond just quenching thirst. The dragon's eye flicked toward its own wound, and something like surprise crossed its face. Dragon blood carries heat. It needs water to carry that heat properly, to keep everything working the way it should. Without it, a wound like this doesn't heal. It just keeps losing ground. And now it's not losing ground as fast. The dragon studied him for a moment. You may have given me more than you realize back there. They kept moving. The horn sounded twice more in the distance, but each time it sounded further away, like the search had shifted direction, hunting a trail that no longer matched where they actually were. Ethan allowed himself a small measure of hope and immediately regretted it, because that was usually when things went wrong. It went wrong an hour later, when a new sound joined the horn, lower, closer to the ground. A baying, rhythmic and eager, the unmistakable sound of tracking hounds that had picked up a scent and weren't going to lose it. They brought dogs, Ethan said, and felt the dragon tense against his shoulder. They know I can't fly, it said. They knew I'd be moving on the ground. They planned for this. Ethan scanned the terrain ahead, dunes rolling out in every direction with nothing that looked like real cover, and his mind raced through every option and came up thin. They couldn't outrun hounds. The dragon couldn't fly. And somewhere behind them, gaining ground with every passing minute, was a search party that wanted this dragon silenced permanently and wouldn't think twice about anyone standing in the way. There, the dragon said suddenly, nodding toward a dark seeming earth ahead, barely visible in the moonlight. A ravine. If we can reach it before they close the distance, the walls might break our scent trail. It was their only option, and they both knew it. Ethan tightened his grip under the dragon's foreleg, and together they pushed forward, faster now, ignoring the pain, ignoring the exhaustion, moving toward the dark cut in the land ahead while the baying grew louder behind them with every step. They didn't know yet what was waiting inside that ravine. They only knew that stopping wasn't an option anymore. They reached the ravine with the hounds close enough now that Ethan could hear individual voices among them, the shouts of handlers keeping pace behind their animals. He half-dragged, half-guided the dragon down the narrow slope into the cut, both of them stumbling over loose stone in the dark, and for a moment, pressed against the cold rock walls of the baying still echoing above, Ethan let himself believe they'd found real cover. Then a lantern flared to life at the far end of the ravine, and he understood they'd walked straight into a trap instead of away from one. Figures emerged from the shadows on both sides, human figures, armed, moving with the coordinated ease of men who had done this kind of work before. Ethan counted 6 as they closed the gap, boxing him and the dragon against the rock wall with no path left to run. A 7th man stepped forward last, unhurried, and lifted his own lantern to study them both. Ethan's stomach turned the moment the light found the man's face, because he recognized it immediately. The same name the dragon had spoken back at the overhang. The same officer half his unit had learned to avoid. Corporal Cole, the commander said, and there was no surprise in his voice at all, only a kind of tired satisfaction, like a man closing out a chore he'd expected to take longer. You've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be. You ordered that caravan burned, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. He needed to hear how the man would respond to it out loud. The commander's expression didn't change. I gave an order that would have ended a problem quietly. This creature refused to follow it, and now I have a very inconvenient dragon who knows things it shouldn't, and a soldier who's decided to play hero in the middle of a war zone. There was no problem, the dragon said, its voice weak but steady, dragging itself half upright against the ravine wall. There were families, children. You ordered them burned to hide what you'd already done. I ordered a mess cleaned up, the commander snapped, and for the first time something genuine flickered under his composure. Something closer to panic than authority. A mess that will end my career. And worse if it ever reaches the wrong ears. So you understand why I can't simply let either of you walk out of this ravine. Ethan felt the weight of the dragon shift beside him. Still leaning on his shoulder. Still barely able to stand on its own. And he understood with a sick certainty that neither of them had the strength left to fight their way out of 6 armed men and a commander with nothing left to lose. You don't have to do this, Ethan said. Stalling, searching for any thread of leverage. There are other men in your command. Word gets out eventually. It always does. Not if there's no one left to spread it, the commander said, and nodded once to the men flanking him. The dragon moved before Ethan could react, pushing off the rock wall and placing itself between him and the approaching soldiers, wings spreading despite the way its whole frame trembled with the effort. It wasn't a strong stance. It wasn't even a stable one, but it was a wall of scale and muscle standing between 6 armed men and the human who had given away everything he had in the desert to keep it alive. "You'll have to go through me," the dragon said, and though its voice was weak, there was nothing uncertain in it. The commander's eyes narrowed. "You can barely stand." "Then it should be an easy fight," the dragon said, and Ethan, standing behind it with his hand still resting against his flank, felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. Whatever happened next, this creature had chosen to spend the last of its strength standing in front of him instead of running. "Take them both," the commander said, and the 6 men moved forward as one. The first man lunged for Ethan's side of the ravine, and the dragon's tail swept low across the stone, catching his legs out from under him before he ever got close. It wasn't a killing blow. Ethan noticed that immediately, even in the chaos, the way the dragon fought to disable rather than destroy, like some part had still refused to cross a line even now, even here, even against men who had come to finish what its own commander started. 2 more soldiers rushed in from the flank. Ethan grabbed a length of fallen branch on the ravine floor and swung it hard into the back of one man's knee, dropping him before he could level his weapon, while the dragon reared back and drove its uninjured wing into the other, sending him sprawling against the rock wall. It was working. Barely, painfully, but it was working, and for a moment Ethan let himself believe they might actually walk out of this. Then the commander stepped forward himself, drawing a blade that caught the lantern light, moving toward the dragon's exposed flank where the old wound still hadn't fully closed. Ethan saw it a half-second before it happened and threw himself into the gap, taking the strike meant for the dragon across his own forearm instead. Pain seared up to his shoulder, and he staggered back against the rock, blood running warm down his sleeve. The dragon's reaction was immediate and total. Something in its eyes changed, exhaustion burning away into something fiercer, and it turned on the commander with a speed that shouldn't have been possible given how weak it had been an hour earlier. It didn't breathe fire. It didn't need to. One sweep of its claws sent the commander's blade spinning into the dark, and a second motion pinned the man against a ravine wall, close enough that he'd feel the heat still radiating off scales that had nearly gone cold in the desert sand. "You have let me die out there," the dragon said, low and even, "and then you have hunted down the one person who showed me mercy. I have watched what your kind of order does to the innocent. I will not watch it happen again." The remaining soldiers had stopped fighting, scattered around the ravine floor, watching their commander held helpless against the rock by a creature they'd been sent to kill. Ethan pushed himself upright, cradling his wounded arm, and stepped forward. "Let them hear it," Ethan said. "All of it. The caravan, the cover-up, all of it. Let his own men decide what kind of orders they've been following." The dragon didn't kill him. It didn't need to. It simply held him there, powerless, while Ethan spoke the truth into the ravine for every remaining soldier to hear. The burned caravan, the order to silence the dragon who refused to follow it, the desperate hunt through the desert to bury the evidence. He watched the faces of the men around him shift as he spoke, disbelief giving way to something colder, something aimed now at the man pinned against the rock instead of at the human and dragon who'd been running from him. By the time Ethan finished, 2 of the commander's own soldiers had lowered their weapons entirely, and a third stepped forward to take the commander into custody with hands that shook with something like shame. The dragon released its grip and stepped back, breathing hard, more from the effort of that final burst of strength than from anything else. It swayed once, and Ethan was there to catch its shoulder before it could fall. "Easy," Ethan said, echoing the same word he'd used back in the hollow when this had all started. "You did enough. Let it end here." Above them, the last of the search horns had gone silent, and for the first time since the scorch marks in sand, the desert felt still instead of dangerous. The walk back to camp took the better part of a day, slower now that both of them were running on nothing but will. Ethan's arm throbbed under a hastily wrapped bandage, and the dragon's step still carried a slight drag from the wounds that hadn't finished healing, but neither of them complained, because complaining felt like the wrong thing to do after everything the desert had already taken from them both. The soldiers who had come to kill the dragon walked with them now, quiet, carrying their former commander between them with none of the swagger they'd arrived with. Word of what happened in the ravine would reach the wider command long before the man himself did, and Ethan suspected that was exactly the kind of justice a burned caravan and a betrayed dragon deserved. Camp came into view as the sun dropped low behind them, painting the dunes gold and orange, and for the first time in 2 days, Ethan let himself feel the exhaustion he'd been holding at bay since the moment he'd heard a voice begging for water in the sand. He collapsed before he reached the gate. The last thing he remembered was the ground rushing up, and then the dragon's forelegs sweeping under him, catching him before he hit the dirt, holding him steady with a gentleness that felt strange coming from something built for war. When he woke, he was lying in the shade of a supply tent, a canteen resting against his hand, cool and full and untouched. He blinked up at the sky and found the dragon curled nearby, watching him with its one good eye, patient in a way it hadn't had the luxury of being back in the desert. "You collapsed 200 yards from camp," the dragon said, and there was something warm running under the words, something that hadn't been there when they first met. "After giving away your only water to a stranger and then walking 3 days on nothing. I imagine that's what your people call irony." Ethan managed a tired laugh and pushed himself up onto one elbow. "Guess I didn't think it through." "No," the dragon agreed. "You didn't. You simply did what needed doing and let the thinking happen afterward. It's a dangerous habit. I hope you never lose it." Ethan reached for the canteen and found his hand shaking slightly as he lifted it. Before he could drink, the dragon nudged it gently with one claw, tipping it just slightly toward him. "Just one sip, sir," it said, and there was nothing weak or desperate in the words this time, only something gentle, something that sounded almost like gratitude wearing the shape of a joke. Ethan looked at the creature that had once begged him for water in a dying voice in the sand, now sitting beside him strong enough to make light of how far they'd both come, and he felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, something steadier than friendship, something closer to the kind of bond that gets forged only when two lives are laid down for each other, and both walk away intact. "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said. "You already paid it back twice over out there." "Debts like this don't work that way," the dragon said. "Not the ones worth keeping." Word came down from command a week later that the corrupt commander had been formally relieved, his actions regarding the caravan under full investigation, and that the dragon who had exposed him would be granted safe passage and recognition rather than continued pursuit. Ethan read the notice twice, sitting outside the supply tent with the dragon resting nearby in the cooling evening air, and felt something like peace settle over the both of them for the first time since this had all begun. The dragon stayed close to his post after that, not out of obligation and not out of debt, but because some bonds, once forged in the desert with nothing but a canteen and a dying whisper between two strangers, simply don't break when the danger passes. They just become something worth keeping.